Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Conversations Over Coffee with me, Rabbi Steve Warnick. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Sharon Graham to the conversation and hope that you will be delighted to welcome her as well. We're going to be talking about Jewish history, especially in Winnipeg and Western Canada. And we'll probably also be talking about the Jewish present, which is something that she and I were chatting about before we let you in on the conversation. But before we get to that, we're on Facebook, YouTube, and betzedek.tv. If you like today's conversation, be sure to give us a thumbs up and share with your friends. Comments are always appreciated and help us get the conversation to more people. If you have questions for our guest, please put them in the Facebook or YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to bring them into the show. With that out of the way, let me introduce our guest. Sharon Graham is an independent scholar who lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba with her family. She is a historian of Canada's Jewish community with a special emphasis on the history of children's care within the Canadian social service sector of the early 20th century. Her doctoral studies focused on the history of the Jewish Orphanage of Western Canada. Previous scholarly endeavors include a master's degree which focused on early synagogue architecture in Toronto. She is currently serving as the Winnipeg Section president of the National Council of Jewish Women of Canada. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Graham to the conversation.
Hello.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi.
I always love reading bios. It's like, we write them so that our mothers would be proud, I think.
Yes, and my mother loves my bio, and she's probably watching, so I'm going to say
hi,
watching.
Mom. Hi, Anne.
I know my sister's watching.
All right.
She already corrected me on something.
So before we dive into the meat of the conversation, is there anything about you that we didn't mention in the bio that's important for people to know?
I don't know. I don't know. I guess I would say that I'm an almost compulsive volunteer, so that's probably something I left off the bio, but is very true. So I have a lot to say about a lot of different aspects of Jewish life because I'm always volunteering with some of them.
What sparked your interest in Jewish academia and studying Jewish history?
I think I was sort of destined for it. I actually went to chat, and the smart kids went into special Talmud when I was there, and the dum-dums went to Jewish history and rabbinics. And I just loved the Jewish history. We had some wonderful educators, especially Dr. Kapustin, I believe he was. He was excellent in the upper years. And so I just sort of fell in love with it. I felt very clearly that this was my history. And I don't know, I guess it feels close enough to touch sometimes Jewish history, more so than many other aspects of history. It's so, it's been taught to me since I was young, and it so clearly results in some of the Jewish life I see around me.
And do you think that's because, so much of Jewish culture and religion is about remembering the past, and that there's maybe also, this notion, we see it so clearly in the Haggadah, right? That every person is obligated to see themselves as if they were coming out of Egypt. So it's not, when we talk about history in Judaism, we don't talk about it necessarily in the past. The other example I'll give is, I'm most embarrassed to do this because, you said that smart kids went to Talmud and the dumb kids went to history, which, of course, you're being sarcastic. But the Mikra Gedolot, even the Talmud, the way in which it's arranged, it's a conversation across time and place.
Mm-hmm.
There's hundreds of years of Jewish experience that exist on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that in rabbinical school, we never talked about Rashi in the past tense.
No.
Always, what does Rashi say?
Right.
How does he inform what we know today? How did that experience work for you?
Well, it goes back to that Abraham Joshua Heschel idea that Jews build cathedrals in time, not in space. So that using that metaphor, a cathedral has a lot of places to explore. And it's true. I still, like I'm not dissing Talmudic study, right? I mean, every time I have to write a Dvar Torah, I'm on Sefaria.org, which if people haven't gone to Sefaria.org, you really should. And you can click on all the commentaries to the Torah portion that you're looking at, and there's Rashi helping you out. And it is very clear that he is helping you out, right? Who he was a man who wanted to help you learn Torah, I think. I don't think I'm saying anything really crazy. When I say that, that's the spirit in which it's offered. So yeah, that feeling like it's all around us, that Jewish history is part of our Jewish, is built into our Jewish life. Some scholars are like, there's some scholars are really clear that this zachor, this memorialization, is not history in the way that we understand it. That historical practice is very different from Jewish remembrance. Jewish remembrance is different. It's the past that's present. It has its own purposes. It may have a very didactic purpose that's very different from the scholarly pursuit of history. Sometimes when you start studying Jewish history as an academic, it can be a little jarring because you're going to have to learn unpleasant things about Jewish personalities, or unpleasant things about those histories, or complicated things about those histories.
That challenge your belief system that you were brought up in. I just want to jump in a moment there. I had this conversation with somebody recently, where I made the comment to them: the Torah is not a history book. It's not interested in history. It may have history in it, but what Torah is interested in is morality.
Right.
And I find it helpful to the truth that Torah is interested in is a different truth than historical truth. And so, so when you talk about Zachor, I think that's really the right way about. There's a difference between Jewish memory and Jewish history. And we tend in the modern era to blur them together. So I just really want to emphasize that. I really appreciate the way you spoke about that.
Yeah, the clearest example with that is in Crusade narratives. So the narratives of Jewish communities that suffered during Crusades and the martyrologies. And there's some evidence that some of those...
You're talking about the high holidays and the Machzor, basically.
No, well, yeah, there's some evidence that they may not be based in truth at all. Now, I don't think that's true. I think some Crusade narratives are too disjointed and distressing not to be real. They're not a clear narrative. They're confusing, like somebody actually lived through it and tried to witness what happened, and it is confusing. But some of them are very pat and have a formula. So this doesn't mean that Crusade massacres didn't happen, but the idea of, and it didn't mean that some Jewish communities didn't commit, for example, mass suicide because of the Crusades. Didn't happen, because we know that some definitely did, but not all of them may have happened in the same way. And the Crusade narratives can be very formulaic. So that's always unsettling to hear, I think, for somebody who's studied Jewish history until upper sort of university levels. That can be unsettling. It's interesting. When you study more recent history, people don't know about it in the same way. And yet it's as gripping as those like Crusade narratives that seem so real. I mean, it's I could talk about this forever. So I'm going to take a sip of my coffee.
So give us an example of a more recent history that can be as gripping as some of the more distant history.
I think the history that I wrote about in my dissertation was really interesting. I had known from just one aspect of it, I had known from my grandpa Alan, who was a member of Beth, that there were Jews in small town Canada following the railways. But what I didn't know was how far out those people were. I mean, he was far out at some point. He was really in the backwoods of northern Ontario. But there were Jews everywhere. And what's more is they kept in touch with the metropoles, with the sort of bigger Jewish centers. And there were people in the bigger Jewish centers who knew all about them. So the orphanage superintendents would travel around, they would travel Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and sometimes to British Columbia, depending how many people there were. And they would make personal relationships with people who had maybe one other Jewish family There were maybe 1 or 2 Jewish families in a town, and the superintendents would know all of them. And then when the orphanage pupils got to their teens, they would be sent out to those little small towns, and they would help in the store, because these were usually merchant Jews. If they were not in a Jewish farm colony, they were merchants who owned a little store. And they would teach the family's children some of the Hebrew for the prayer book, some Yiddish, maybe a little more, but mostly that, like just some Jewish survival skills. And that was in really tiny towns. Like the one I always remember is Drumheller, Alberta, because that's where the big dinosaur national park is. And there's all those wonderful bones. And I think it's in the Badlands. Like that's a very small town. You know, it wasn't a big town, and the Jewish component was teeny weeny. And yet they were all connected in many ways through B'nai B'rith, through the orphanage, through Zionist organizations. So that sense of connectedness of the Canadian Jewish community being really connected over this enormous territory, it was a very real feeling.
Did other ethnic or religious communities connect in the same way as the Jews did? Because we have this sense of our own past, and the sense of being in a diaspora, in exile for thousands of years, of still having this sense of a worldwide peoplehood, and a connection. I mean, we know of letters that are being written from certainly amongst the rabbis, when people need to be ransomed as well, and stuff like that. Is that something that's unique to the Jewish community, or is that something that was common amongst others as well?
I don't know if the kinship ties were maintained in the same way. I think that diaspora communities in Canada definitely try to keep in touch with each other over these long distances. The Chinese community was very connected through letters, especially since they faced a lot of legal challenges, first to get to Canada, then to settle in Canada, then to have members of their family brought over, because at first only single men were allowed over, and then to continue owning their own businesses and working in their own businesses. So they had many, many similar challenges, and they did have that kind of very strong network. Ukrainian Canadians, I think, did, but I'm not sure if those early farming families, they connected over church building, and they would connect through their church, but I'm not sure they had a lot of time for traveling necessarily. I think they were staying connected through their clergy when they could bring them over. And Mennonites definitely, I mean, I live in Manitoba, so I know a lot about Mennonites. They definitely are a very cohesive group, even though now there's a lot of secular
I remember
Mennonites.
Growing up in Winnipeg, going on a trip to a Mennonite community in middle school.
Oh, nice. Was it the Mennonite Heritage Park?
Probably, I don't remember.
Yeah. When I first moved here, I would hear people speaking what I thought was Yiddish, and it really wasn't Yiddish.
It wasn't. Well, that's the old that's the with the Amish too, right?
Yes.
That's the Frisco kid, Landsman.
Yeah, because it's Low German, and I mean, people can actually understand each other between Low German and Yiddish. They can actually sort of understand each other. It's not impossible at all.
Right. I want to just remind those that are watching that if you have a question for Sharon, please ask it on Facebook or YouTube in the chat, and we'll try to bring it into the show. I want to ask about the orphanage of Western Canada.
Yes.
You did your dissertation on that. What was the question that you were trying to address, and what were some of the surprising learnings that you had from that research?
I think the question was, how did they pull it off? Because to run a childcare institution is very expensive. And you have to walk a very tight line in between state authorities, what they want out of from a childcare institution, and the Jewish community and the children and the parents. So how did they make it work as long as they did? It was the latest. It closed the latest of all the orphanages in Canada. The Jewish orphanages in Canada, it closed very late in 1948. I believe Toronto's closed in the 30s.
What year did it close?
It closed in 1948.
Same year that Israel was founded.
Yes, yes. But by 1945, it was basically closed. And they just had a few children staying there. And then in 48 or 49, when some of the Holocaust refugee children came over, they were mostly actually teenagers. Mm-hmm. They stayed in that building while foster families were arranged, but it wasn't the same type of organization at all anymore. It was really, they were just being cared for in this one place, but it wasn't, and they were part of their own group, not necessarily part of the orphanage itself. So I didn't actually write about them very much. It was very late, and it existed. Canadians always say, what did this have to do with residential schools, right? Because for Canadians, that's what we think about when we think about institutional childcare in Canada, is we think about the network of residential schools. And actually, it had nothing to do with residential schools, which is weird. Because what I found in my research is that the Jewish orphanage staff were part of the Winnipeg social service milieu. And they had communications with staff at, for example, the Portage La Prairie Industrial School for Boys. And they talked professionally with social workers from the Children's Bureau, which oversaw all sorts of institutions and services for families. So I always think that the Jewish orphanage was kind of the mirror image, the reverse of the Indian residential school. The Canadian state, which, by the way, didn't like Jews very much, was okay with Jews running an institution that existed entirely to ensure that Jewish children received a Jewish education. That was its reason for existing. It's pretty interesting, when you think about the context.
Was it that Jewish orphans received a Jewish education?
Yes. Jewish children. There's always very few orphans. I mean, there's very few orphans in the world. Even now, in some countries, there are orphanages full of children, very poor countries, and those children either have parents or aunts and uncles and grandparents. I mean, they may not have all their parents, they might not have both their parents, they might not have a huge family network, but there's almost no children alive who don't have kin. So it's always very romantic to think about orphans. That's why it's called an orphanage. Even the Italian Renaissance orphanages were not orphanages because those children had been abandoned due to poverty. So it's not that there's orphans. It's very rare. It's very rare.
And what were the key successes of the orphanage?
It really did house a lot of children and gave them a very positive Jewish education for the most part. And they were happy with their Jewish education. They were fed and clothed probably better than a lot of children in Winnipeg at the same time. They received the medical care that they needed. I found very few deaths on record, most of which could not have been prevented. So they were materially looked after. Many of them remained in touch.
Was that because, I don't know the history on this fully, but from what I understand, Manitoba and Saskatchewan were amongst the first provinces that saw medical treatment as a right and not as a privilege.
No, I wish I could say that, but first of all, that wasn't actually true of Manitoba. It was true of Saskatchewan and even Alberta and Newfoundland. Actually, it was because of the Jewish community of the Western provinces and the Jewish doctors who formed a committee. And so between the Jewish doctors sometimes volunteering and sometimes having to ask for payment, but providing care, and the Jewish community paying for things, even medical devices. Some parents couldn't afford things like special shoes or glasses. But if their children were in the orphanage would find a way, if they couldn't pay for it, for another organization to sponsor or a donor to sponsor.
I know that one of the other areas of Winnipeg that you've at least written about is the story of the memorial boards of Eitz Chaim, and how they tell the story of the previous Jewish community and communities.
Mhm.
Why don't you share with us a little bit of what that's about?
So the memorial boards are these rooms in sort of on the first floor of the synagogue. So Eitz Chaim is the last North End synagogue. I'm not going to say it's the last North End synagogue, but it's the last North End big synagogue. There's actually a few smaller congregations, some of which are very vibrant, but it's the last one that can have both a rabbi and a cantor, and catering staff and things like that. So Winnipeg is sort of used to be. I would say it isn't anymore, but it used to be divided between North and South. And the North End Jews were from the original immigrants who lived in this hard scrabble but close neighborhood, and like really lived a kind of Kensington Market, Lower East Side life. And then the South End Jews were sort of like the descendants of the very earliest arrivals in Winnipeg, and they were wealthy and fancy and snooty. By the time you were living in Winnipeg, that divide must have seemed very real. Now that divide is almost completely gone, because in the 90s, the Jewish community built a brand new JCC, Jewish Community Campus. It's in the South End, and now Jewish life is everywhere.
Well, it's not just the campus, isn't just the JCC. It's the JCC, the Federation Building, Gray Academy is there.
Yeah, it's the Jewish community.
It's really Jewish community campus.
Yeah, it's really centralized. So Eitz Chaim is the last big sort of suburban shul. I always liked it because it's on the Orphanage lot. So it's right next to where I studied.
Oh, wow.
And it's a product of many mergers. Of course, shuls had to start merging after World War II. Beth Tzedek is a merger, right? It's McCall Street and Gold Tzedek. And shuls just started merging, right? Those immigrant stiebels couldn't really make a go of it. Right. Yeah. So that was the first round of mergers in the post-war period. But then in the early 2000s, Rosh Pina and B'nai Abraham and, oh, golly, what's the other ones? There was another one.
Beth Jacob, was it?
Beth Israel, I think.
Beth
maybe.
Israel.
Anyway, they were all very nice shuls and very and modern shuls too, built in the post-war period, buildings at least. They had to merge because the community had so decisively moved away from the North End. So those shuls themselves, except for Rosh Pina, were a product of amalgamation. They had gone through that previous round in the 40s and 50s. So what this congregation inherited were these sets of Yizkor boards, bronze boards with all the names on the little plaques and a little light bulb beside. And they had to figure out a way to incorporate them in the synagogue. This was very important to all three synagogue members when they were discussing amalgamation. So what they did is they took this sort of big empty area in the synagogue on the first floor near the cloakroom, and they built about 4 rooms, 3-sided with a wall facing them, but like room you can walk through, and they hold all the boards. But one of the things I really had to think about is, memorial boards are kind of a weird thing. Like they're definitely a North American invention. If they're in other synagogues around the world, I apologize, but I guarantee you that they're from post-World War I, because that's sort of when they started in North America. And they were a way for shuls to get in some income and for people to feel like they had memorialized their parents. Because the thing about a memorial board is that, let's say you can't go to, or don't want to, or can't go to synagogue to say Kaddish on the yahrzeit of your parents' passing. But you know that the custodian at the shul where you paid for their memorial plaque will turn the little light bulb right next to the plaque.
Not just able to go to the shul, I think it's also not able to go to the cemetery.
Yes. So you're not able to go to the cemetery because you've moved. You're not able to go to the shul because you don't go to shul anymore. right? Or you don't feel comfortable. That's always something we forget. Sometimes people don't go to shul because they don't feel comfortable.
Right.
But the good thing about this is that the synagogue building itself will observe the art site for you. So we have these intense ties to these sort of almost religious objects that are completely new to Judaism. And so the shul had to build these strange rooms, which, by the way, nobody can use. I mean, they're useless. They are literally exist to hold plaques, and that makes them kind of a dead space. And what happens is people walk around them.
There's some shuls that'll put like a bench in that space and invite people to meditate.
Yes.
You know, to come and to sit in quiet and reflect on their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can have a use in that way, shape, or form.
Right.
You know, we were talking before we went live about history and the present. I'm always concerned, you know, by these plaques and Yahrzeit and Yisker that we become a people that worship the dead too much and not enough of celebrating what's in front of us and the life that's possible.
Yeah.
You know, the question I want to ask is not really one about that. That's just my own statement of, I don't know what I reflect on these conversations, but to what extent do you see, or what's the relationship between these kinds of this past of the orphanage and the memorial boards and Jewish life now taking place, especially in a place like Winnipeg?
I think it shows that Jews are actually probably the most creative religious thinkers on earth. And therefore, we have endless possibilities that we can be exploring without any fear that we will be violating halakha, or if halakha isn't important, the spirit of Judaism. An orphanage is a Christian institution. There's no Jewish rationale for it. There's no Jewish history for orphanages before Jews lived in Christian countries and Christian orphanages were established that started taking in Jewish children. Otherwise, there's no such thing as a Jewish orphanage. And now there are no more Jewish orphanages left in North America because the institution was not useful anymore. It was not needed. It was not necessary. Yisker boards helped bridge those generations between the first immigrants who were so concerned about yard sites, about memorials, especially if they had left their families behind, or after the Holocaust left everything behind. They needed those memorial boards, and then their children needed to respect that, to keep that link. I don't know if memorial boards are going to keep being used, but I bet we'll find something else. And so I think Jews have to be really open to creativity and to really understand that this is an integral part of Jewish life. Religious creativity is actually a tradition. And so all the little bits that we pick up, we can lose them, right? If we don't need them anymore, but we need to keep the spirit of it, which is that we have to keep going forward as Jews. We have to maintain ourselves as Jews, but we have all the tools in the world and we'll find a way to use them. And, you know, we'll find a way to use them with halakha. We'll find a way to use them with how we are comfortable with Jews. But we actually are a people full of potential. So I'm always an optimist when it comes to Jewish continuity. I don't know why, because I also have like this really dark, oh my God, what's happening in the world? The Jews were so picked on and blah, whatever. It doesn't really matter because actually the truth is that Jews are very religiously creative, and we can find our own institutions, our own methods, and our own practices. You know, most of the practices of Jewish life today became popular in the early modern period in the 16th century. So the 1500s is when they spread after the invention of the printing press. Yahrzeit, that's when you have to know a death date. You need that written down. Birthdays, so bar mitzvahs, all these ways of doing things are extremely creative new ceremonies that we can't live without anymore. So we have the capacity to keep going forward just by continuous invention and thinking things through ritually.
So Sharon, one last question. You mentioned that you're a serial volunteer.
Yes.
What's exciting you right now in the area of Jewish creativity?
I really think in the Canadian context, so I'm part of National Council of Jewish Women. We don't necessarily have a statement on reconciliation with Indigenous people as part of our section yet. But I see that we have started making bridges with a lot of neighborhood social service organizations, and most of those are Indigenous run, especially run for Indigenous women. I think Canadian Jewish creativity can lead to really good reconciliation efforts. We have to put our mind to it, and we have to do it in a spirit not of we're going to do wonderful things for other people, but instead we will learn from other people. But I do think that there's a lot of creativity out there for reconciliation and for making Canada a better place for everybody that can come from Jewish creativity, Jewish openness.
Maybe our next conversation should be about that.
Absolutely.
Sharon, thank you so much. This was really delightful.
Thank you.
Next time you're in Toronto visiting family, please look us up.
I will.
Maybe we'll find a gig for you while you're here. I hope to get to Winnipeg eventually. I grew up there, junior high and high school. My father, as I said, was a rabbi at Sharon in the late 70s and 80s. My mom is buried in the Sharon Cemetery.
Oh, nice.
I certainly have reason to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you so much for this conversation. I look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dina.
For next week, we're going to take a week off. So there'll be a rerun that will be airing next Monday at 12:30 for Conversations Over Coffee. The week after that, I think it's the 22nd, Dr. Orobon will be my guest. He is an expert on international relations at the University of Toronto with a specialty in Russia. So we're going to talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war and the impact of the war on international aid agencies such as the Jewish Agency, which is currently experiencing some source from Russia in terms of its operations there. So that'll be in 2 weeks. We'll hope to see you then. Thanks everyone for joining us. For more information on how you can be our partners in an inspired and meaningful Jewish life, be sure to visit us online, www.beth-tzedek.org. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.